My name is Dr. Bret Bennington, and I want to welcome everybody to our lecture this afternoon. Let me just tell you a little bit about myself, just a few words here. I am a professor of paleontology, professor of geology at Hofstra University. I've been teaching at Hofstra for over 25 years, and I'm currently the chair of the Department of Geology, Environment, and Sustainability at Hofstra. By training, I'm a paleontologist, so I'm interested in the history of the Earth and the history of life on Earth, but I'm also interested in the history of the science of geology. And what we're going to do today is have a little bit of a history lesson and learn about one of the more interesting figures in the history of paleontology, particularly vertebrate paleontology, the study of animals with backbones. Her name is Mary Anning, and she played a big role in the early history of vertebrate paleontology, and she's one of paleontology's lesser known heroes, but she's becoming better known as time goes on. So the way this is going to work is I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to look at a slide presentation that I'll be talking about. We'll also jump in and use Google Earth a little bit so I can show you the part of the world that we're talking about. And then when we need to, we'll jump to a different camera and we'll look at some specimens through a document camera. And also I've got one specimen I'll show you through a microscope. So I hope you find it interesting, and if you think of questions you want to ask that don't need to be answered immediately, type them into the chat room, and then we'll have a record of them. And then after we're done, we can spend as much time answering questions as people want to take. If you have a question that you really think needs to be answered immediately, unmute yourself and ask. That's fine. I don't mind taking questions. All right. So if anybody if no one has questions now, we'll get started. So I'm going to, as I said, I'm going to share my screen here. Okay, so everyone should see the first slide in the presentation. And okay, whoops. There we go. So as I said, our topic today is Mary Anning. And Mary Anning lived at the beginnings of the Victorian era. She was a well-known fossilist, and I'll talk about what that term means in a minute. And many people would call her the first woman of paleontology. She may not have been the first female paleontologist, but I think she was the first female paleontologist of great importance. And she's kind of been blowing up lately. After, kind of existing in obscurity for the last 160 years, in the last decade or so, she's kind of taken over the spotlight. So some of you may be familiar with an historical novel that came out in 2009 called Remarkable Creatures, written by the same author who wrote The Girl with the Pearl Earring. And this is a fictional treatment of Mary Anning's life, or at least part of her life. And then more recently, a movie came out called Ammonite, which depicts a fictional romantic relationship that Mary Anning almost certainly didn't have, but it's fun to imagine what might have happened in history. And then also there have been a couple biographies recently. So in 2006, a biography came out called Jurassic Mary. And then more recently in 2009, The Fossil Hunter. And both of these give a full account of Mary Anning's life. So she's, after being in obscurity for a long time, she's kind of having her moment in the sun. And so it's a good time to talk about her. Who was Mary Anning? Well, she was a woman who was born and who lived her entire life in Lyme Regis, which is a small seaside town on the southern coast of England. I'll show you where in a minute or so. She was born into a very poor family, and her father was a cabinet maker, but in order to help put food on the table, the whole family engaged in fossil collecting so that they could sell fossils as souvenirs. And we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. To give you an idea of how poor her family was, she was one of 10 children. Of the 10, only her and her brother Joseph survived much beyond early childhood. So very high early childhood mortality, which was common in poor families in Europe at the time. Her father also died at a relatively early age, and when Mary was only 10 years older. So, and at that point on, she became kind of the head of the fossil business in the family, and spent the rest of her life collecting fossils and selling them. And in the course of her relatively short life, she died at the age of 47. She discovered many very important new creatures and brought them to light and put them in the hands of the leading geologists of the time. And so she made a huge contribution to the science, as we'll see. And throughout her life, she ends up becoming friends with just about every important geologist in England and also on the continent. And these men came to Lyme Regis to consult with her and to buy the remarkable creatures that she was finding. So here's just a couple of photos showing the river Lyme, which is what the town is named after, right where it kind of reaches the shoreline in the middle of town there. And then just outside of town is a graveyard where you can visit the tombstone of Mary and her brother Joseph. And this is a good point to just jump from the slide presentation, and let's just go to Google Earth here and see where Lyme Regis is. So we're going to fly from Long Island to the UK across the pond here. And then we're going down to the south coast of England. And the south coast of England is famous for cliffs that expose layers of rock from the Mesozoic era, the age of dinosaurs. And those cliffs to the east include the famous chalk cliffs of Dover. And as you travel west across the southern coast of England, you kind of go down through the pile of rock layers and things get a little bit older. Lyme Regis is a small town located along the coast. It's famous as a bathing town, a seaside town, where for hundreds of years the English have been coming to summer and to bathe in the ocean and hang out on the beach. But besides bathing and summering, Lyme Regis is also famous for the cliffs exposed along the shoreline. And in the Google Earth image here, you can see that there's quite an extensive exposure of a big thick pile of sedimentary rock layers that are all pretty much horizontal, pretty much flat line. So the younger layers are at the top, and these layers date to the end of the age of dinosaurs. And as you go down the pile, you descend through time into the earlier part of the age of dinosaurs. And because of coastal storms in the wintertime, these cliffs are continuously eroding. They're very unstable. This area here is a section where a part of the cliff has collapsed and slumped down onto the beach. And you can see kind of flowed out over the beach here. This is called the Black Ven. So this constant coastal erosion creates a very dangerous situation for collectors, particularly if you're out in the wintertime after storms, but also the storms are exposing new fossils. And Mary Anning relied on these winter storms and the collapse of the cliffs periodically to bring new specimens to light for her to collect and to sell. And so in the vicinity of Lyme Regis, you have a very extensive cliff line that runs along the coast. So lots and lots of rock exposed, producing fossils as the cliffs erode, both to the west, or I'm sorry, to the east, and also to the west of the town. So that gives you an idea of where in the world that we're talking about here. So let's jump back into the slides. Just a few photos to give you a sense of what Lyme Regis is like. My wife Gail and I visited Lyme Regis in the summer of 2019. So most of these photographs are from that recent visit. This is the main beach area of the town. And you can see that there's an artificial breakwater called the Cobb, which has been there for hundreds and hundreds of years. And there probably was a similar structure dating back to Roman times. And this creates a safe harbor for small boats and fishing boats, which is one of the things that has made Lyme Regis a notable town for quite some time. It's a rare anchorage along the south coast of England. Here's a view from the Cobb looking back at the town. So it's a quaint little seaside English town, and then looming off in the distance to the east, you can see the cliffs. Now, a little bit of history before we get into the paleontology. Mary Anning was born at the end of the 1700s when England and France were at war with one another. This is during the reign of Napoleon. So these were the Napoleonic Wars. And the main effect that the Napoleonic Wars had on England and Mary Anning and her family was to create great economic hardship, both during the war and then when the Napoleonic Wars ended, the various recessions and economic difficulties continued for much of her life. As I said, her father died when she was 11, which really put her family in tremendously dire financial straits. And an important thing to appreciate about Mary Anning was that she was born into the lowest possible status in British society. She was, basically poor as poor can be, living just at the kind of fluctuating above and below the poverty line. Her family were also not members of the Church of England, so she and her family were considered dissenters, which made them even more of outcasts in British society. And of course, she was female, and women were second-class citizens in European society at the time, denied access to universities, to professional society. So Mary Anning never really had any prospects of becoming a savant, an educated member of the scientific community. She had to get in through the back door, so to speak. And in her life, she received very little formal professional recognition for all of her accomplishments. And we'll talk about that as we go along here. In spite of all this, though, she did manage to befriend just about every important geologist working to understand the history of the Earth in the early 1800s, which was a critical time in the history of geology, as we'll talk about moving along here. She wasn't completely ignored, and she wasn't completely neglected by these famous men who came to her for fossils and for expertise. And in fact, on 3 separate occasions, her and her family were bailed out of very dire financial situations through the intervention of these gentlemen. Now, what did Mary do? Well, she was in the fossil business. She was a fossilist, and a fossilist, that was a term applied to people who collected fossils to make a living. Most of the fossils the Annings collected were small fossils, which I'll show you examples of in a few minutes. that the locals referred to as curiosities, which were sold to tourists and amateur and then also professional fossil collectors. The big interesting vertebrate fossils that we'll talk about later on, things like ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs, were what made Mary Anning famous, and also what made the family a lot of money when they could find them. Right? But mostly what they sold were small fossils like this golden pyritized ammonite that you can see in the photo there. So, you know, in between big fossil finds, which brought in a lot of money, they kind of just scraped along selling these little trinkets. And most of the fossils were collected in the wintertime after storms caused erosion of the cliffs and brought new fossils to light. And this was, as I mentioned, incredibly dangerous work. A couple of times during her life, Mary came close to being buried in landslides, and one landslide in 1833 was so close that it killed her dog, this small terrier that would accompany her to the, along the shoreline. And she actually trained the dog to guard, finds. So if she found something important, she would have the dog stand there and guard it while she went and got help to excavate it. And her poor dog was buried right next to her in one of these landslips. So what was Mary collecting? She was collecting snake stones and devil's toenails and vertebrates and crocodile teeth, thunderstones and pentacrinites. And these are some photos here to show there's a pentacrinites on the left, upper left. There's a snake stone, a whole mass of snake stones, looks like a coiled snake. Thunderstones were these things that look like thunderbolts. Crocodile teeth were fossil teeth. Vertebrates were fossil vertebrae, and devil's toenails were these kind of interesting coiled shells, which turn out to be oysters. And let me just stop the sharing here. I'm going to switch to another camera, and I can show you some examples of these curies. I'm going to go to my hover cam here. There we go. Probably the most sought after and most common fossils that you find on the beach at Lyme Regis are the snake stones. And this is a good example of a snake stone here. Give the camera a chance to focus in on it. Looks like a coiled rope or fire hose or a snake. These are the shells of a type of squid called an ammonite. So here's a plastic toy reconstruction of what a living ammonite might have looked like. So these are distantly related to modern shellless squid, and kind of cousins to the pearly nautilus, which is really the only living squid that has an external shell. And these ammonites come in a variety of different sizes. Most of them are relatively small. These are a few that I bought in one of the local gift shops in Lyme Regis. If you bring a hammer to the beach and break open stones, you can collect your own. There's another example. Again, this is from Lyme Regis. Some of them get to be very large, and in fact, the largest ammonites can be measured in meters in diameter. So those are some examples of snake stones. My personal favorite are the devil's toenails, which is a peculiar type of oyster, now extinct, called a gryphea. So in this particular oyster, one of the shells is a cup, and the other shell forms kind of a lid on the cup. And it does look a bit like a gruesome toenail. If you enjoy eating oysters, and I personally love oysters, you're living in the wrong part of geological history. In the Mesozoic, oysters were very, very diverse and very abundant. And no doubt these cup-shaped coiled oysters would have been very tasty. And you can imagine, you know, a whole plate of these kind of sitting there on the half shell for you. Here's a vertebrate. This is a rather large vertebra from an ichthyosaur. And we'll talk about ichthyosaurs in a minute. If you know your Greek, ichthy means fish, saur means lizard. And the reason ichthyosaurs got the name ichthyosaurs is because their bones look like fish bones. So this particular vertebrae here looks a lot like a fish vertebra. And this is a fairly large one. You know, probably the most common ones are much smaller than this because, you know, most animals die when they're young. So you would tend to find disarticulated fossils of small bones from young animals, and then the larger ones are more rare. Well, let me lift the whole tray. Here's a whole tray of thunderstones. And what are these things? They look kind of like cigars. They're made out of calcium carbonate mineral. This particular collection of thunderstones here is from New Jersey. I collected these near the town of Marlborough in New Jersey. It turns out in kind of running down the southern central part of New Jersey are layers of sediment that date to the Mesozoic era, the age of dinosaurs. And you can collect marine fossils similar to the ones that you find at Lyme Regis, a little bit younger in New Jersey. So these are shells from the inside of a squid, you know, a small squid called a belemnite. And these squid were very common in the oceans of the Jurassic and the Cretaceous during the age of dinosaurs. And they're among the most common fossils that you find in layers of marine rock from that time. And then finally, I'm going to switch over to my microscope camera here. And what you're looking at under the microscope, let me get a pair of tweezers for scale here. There we go. Just to give you a sense of the size here. These little things that look like starfish are called pentacranites, penta meaning five-sided. And these are skeletal plates from an animal called a sea lily, which is related to starfish and sea urchins. So imagine kind of taking a starfish, flipping it upside down, and putting it on a stem, and that's a sea lily or a crinoid. And these star-shaped pieces are the individual plates that would make up the stem. Imagine a stack of poker chips forming a column. These are like star-shaped poker chips that stacked up to form the stem of the crinoids. And they're fairly common as fossils. You extract them out of the rock or you know, out of you know, mudstone, and they're you know, interesting little bits and pieces that you could collect and sell. All right, so oops, hold on a second. Just let me switch back to my main camera here, and let's take a quick breather and pause for a moment and see if anybody has any questions so far. If you have a question, just unmute yourself and ask.
Hey, Dr. B.
Hey, Rebecca.
Those Pentecosti, you said that it was like a stack of them, but I don't know, it seemed like most of them that were found were only a thin slice. Has anybody ever found like a whole stack all connected?
Oh, sure, yeah. So if you're lucky, you might find a whole crinoid with the top part, you know, kind of a folded up starfish. You know, the top of a crinoid is a bulbous body with a bunch of kind of branching arms that formed a filter feeding net. So water would flow past, the current would flow past the arms, and the arms would gather little food particles and sort of stream them into the center where the mouth was. So if you're having a particularly good day, you might find a whole one that got knocked over and buried in mud before it could get completely, disarticulated. But once these things died, the tissues holding the individual skeletal pieces together would decay very quickly, and then the waves and the currents would just scatter the individual pieces willy-nilly. So typically you just find the individual pieces.
Could I ask a question about the three geologists or the three scientists who helped her out financially?
Sure, Jane.
I only know about her and pterosaurs. I don't know if it's related to that or to other kind of geologists, but I'd be curious to know who they were if you know, and what field maybe.
We'll get there. I have it. I'm going to talk about them later. So great question. You're setting me up for later. I can basically rather earlier in her life, a gentleman who was one of her major customers, and he wasn't a geologist. He was a professional. He was just a collector. He was a reasonably wealthy man who liked to collect fossils. And I guess at one point he became so concerned for her family's well-being that he actually sold his entire fossil collection to raise money, which he then donated to the family. A considerable sum of money. It basically kept them solvent for probably a decade or so. And then later in her life, when she came on hard times, some of the geologists who had come to know her and be friends with her raised money in a couple of different ways that I'll talk about to help support her. So great question. Thank you for that. All right, last chance for questions now, and then if not, we'll get back into it.
Will a recording of this be available for later viewing?
Yes, we are recording right now. All right, so let me share my screen again, and let's go back into the presentation here. So let me show you some pictures of the Jurassic coast, the area where Mary was doing her fossil collecting. And again, these are pictures that my wife and I took when we were there just a couple summers ago. So if you do ever get to Lyme Regis, there is a small museum right in the middle of town, the Lyme Regis Museum, and they run tours, fossil collecting tours, very reasonable, small fee. You sign up, and then they have some paleontologists who take large groups of people out onto the beach and spend 3 or 4 hours with everyone, showing them what the geology is and what the fossils are, and talking about Mary Anning, and it's a really, really wonderful experience. This is some of the signage that they have right along the shoreline. There's a big, concrete seawall that you walk along, and then stairs that lead you down onto the beach. So you can see, some examples of the fossils that Mary was collecting and a little bit about her. The rock layers that are exposed in Lyme Regis are rocks known as the blue lias. And the blue refers to the kind of bluish color. And lias is an old term that seems to refer to the alternating layers of mudstone or shale, and then the blocky layers, which are limestone. Most of the fossils tend to occur in the limestone, which the limestone layers probably represent long periods of time when not much was, except fossils were accumulating on the seafloor. And then the muddy layers probably represent periods when storms were washing mud into the offshore environment. So just some pictures. If you wander along the beach and look at the rocks, you see lots of interesting examples of fossils. These are burrows, tunnels that were made into the mud on the seafloor, probably by small shrimp, which are very common in warm water environments, even in the world today. And they dig these little tunnels. If you look carefully, you see a lot of these coiled fossils. These are the snake stones or the ammonites, and the individual chambers that you see inside the coil were actually hollow chambers inside the living shell. Ammonites are like living submarines. The inside of the shell is full of chambers that are partially filled with water and partially filled with gas. And these chambers keep the animal neutrally buoyant. So it can dive, it can ascend. It neither has a tendency to float nor sink. A lot like a submarine. There's a large coil of an ammonite, just to give you an example of the fact that some of these got to be pretty sizable. Here's a coiled shell that's covered in oysters. So that shows that this particular ammonite, after it died, its shell just kind of sat around on the seafloor for a while, and oysters were able to colonize it before it was buried. And as I mentioned before, many different types of oysters lived in the oceans during the Jurassic. Here's another block showing, again, lots of ammonite fossils. To get them out, you really do need a hammer. You got to break a lot of rock open. Find them. There's some more. There's a very large one that they found when they were building the seawall. So they just incorporated it into the concrete of the pier as a display. So this particular ammonite's about 3 feet in diameter. There's the Lyme Regis Museum right in the center of town. The museum actually occupies the site of the first house that Mary Anning lived in, and the house that she grew up in. It's right on the shore, so the house was prone to flooding during winter storms, and later in her life, when she and her mother and her brother were able to afford to, they moved to a house a little bit further up the hill in town, so they could get away from the flooding. Now, as I mentioned before, Mary's fossil collecting activities attracted geologists and paleontologists to Lyme Regis to purchase her specimens and to consult with her, because she, through experience, became quite an accomplished paleontologist in her own right. One of the people who probably most frequently visited Mary Anning was William Buckland, and he grew up not far from Lyme Regis, and so around Christmas time he was usually in the area, and this, again, being winter, was a good time for collecting, so he would visit her and sometimes spend days and even weeks at a time in town searching for fossils with her. And we'll talk about him in a minute. He's a pretty important figure in the history of geology. Other visitors that came to Lyme Regis were people like Louis Agassiz, who was a Swiss geologist. Roderick Murchison and Gideon Mantell were both English geologists. And then Charles Lyell and Adam Sedgwick are two of probably the most famous English geologists of the 1800s. So she knew and in some cases became very good friends with some of the most important scientists of her time. And it's a little bit perplexing, or at least frustrating, in that, considering how well she knew these people and how important her specimens were to their published papers and their careers, how little recognition she got. This was partly because she was female, but I think partly, if not mostly, because she was poor and because she was collecting fossils to sell them. And at that time, people who were fossilists were generally not given any recognition. The people who got the recognition for discoveries were not the actual discoverers. They were the savants who published descriptions and explanations of the discovery. So she, you know, being ignored by the people who were buying her fossils wasn't unusual. It wasn't, you know, wasn't just her. But certainly, if she had been a man, she probably would have gotten more recognition than she did. And it's not clear, you know, if this troubled her or not. I mean, being able to sell the fossils and keep food on the table was probably her primary consideration. But there is a young woman who was a visitor to Lyme Regis, who was convalescing, and kept a diary, befriended her, and in one of her diary entries, she reports that Mary was complaining about how the world has used her ill. These men of learning have sucked her brains and made a great deal of published works, of which she furnished the contents while she derived none of the advantages. So it does seem likely that she did find it frustrating that you know, her efforts were not being formally recognized. So this is a very important slide here because it shows a timeline from 1750 to around you know, 1900 here, with Mary Anning in the middle, and it shows the famous people who overlapped with her, and the people whose timelines are in green are ones that knew Mary Anning personally, and people who she met. The two gentlemen in orange are people that would have known of her, and we know Georges Cuvier, you know, knew about her and her fossils, and they also kind of bracket her. So Cuvier lived, you know, mostly before Mary Anning. Charles Darwin overlaps with her and then extends beyond her, and then everybody else is kind of in between. And what's important about Mary Anning is she's sitting here in the early 1800s, kind of right at the transition between when what we might call the pre-Adamite history of the world. You know, the geologic history of the world is mostly unknown. History back in the 1700s is encompassed primarily by the Old Testament of the Bible, and most educated people, these savants, knew that the Earth had a long history that predated whatever, you know, was somehow incorporated into Genesis, but they didn't know anything about it. And then most of our understanding of our modern understanding of the geological history of the Earth started to come together during the lifetime of Mary Anning, and by the mid-1800s, by the time that Charles Darwin was actively researching evolution and working on the origin of species, these various geologists had managed to do a pretty good job of fleshing out what the ancient history of the Earth was like. And the reason why Mary Anning's important is because she contributed to this growing and new understanding of what ancient life was like in very important ways. So her contemporaries were people like William Buckland. Why is William Buckland important? Well, he's one of the first people who manages to figure out how to piece together information about the past from rocks and from fossils. And Georges Cuvier is in that same category. Georges Cuvier was the scientist. The word scientist didn't really exist in the late 1700s. These people would have called themselves savants. And so Georges Cuvier is the first person to demonstrate that fossils represent not just the remains of past life, but species that are no longer on the Earth, species that have gone extinct. And he makes it his mission to kind of illustrate the different interesting and unusual types of vertebrate animals that lived in the past and aren't here anymore. William Buckland kind of picks up on that, and William Buckland, one of the extinct animals that he describes is the first dinosaur ever discovered, this thing called Megalosaurus. Henry de la Beche and William Conybeare publish papers on extinct vertebrates that lived in the oceans, and both of these gentlemen relied on the fossils that Mary Anning discovered, which I'll show you in a minute here. Louis Agassiz was an expert on fossil fish who went on to prove that the reality of ice ages in the history of the Earth. Richard Owen was a British comparative anatomist and paleontologist who is the man who gave us the term dinosaur. In a report on British fossil reptiles published in the early 1840s, he coined the term dinosaur to describe these newly discovered extinct giant reptiles, which he said were different from modern reptiles. So this was a critical period in the history of our understanding of life on Earth, and Mary Anning was kind of in the right place at the right time. Her two most important discoveries were ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs, and she didn't discover the first fossils of these animals, but she discovered the first complete ones. And it's, you know, it was difficult for people to appreciate what these animals were like until they had complete specimens to look at. If you want to see Mary Anning's most important specimens, you know, she sold her specimens to collectors, and most of these collectors ended up selling or donating their specimens to the British Museum, and now they are housed in the Natural History Museum in London. And there's this wonderful hall of fossil marine reptiles where you can see more ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs than anyone probably needs to see, although I personally can't get enough of them. Other places you might find specimens that Mary Anning collected are at the Oxford Museum of Natural History, and then some other smaller natural history museums throughout southern England. What's an ichthyosaur? Well, ichthyosaur is a fish lizard. It is an extinct marine reptile that is built a lot like a fish or a dolphin, in that it was completely adapted to life in the water, never ever leaving the water, and swimming very much like a fish by using a broad tail fin to propel itself through the water, and then using its fins to steer. So this is the mode of life that fish and modern dolphins and whales have. This skull is the first ichthyosaur fossil that Mary Anning found. It was actually found by her brother when she was 12 years old, and it was the first major fossil sale that the Annings made. Her brother discovered the skull in 1811, and then a year later, Mary was able to discover the rest of the skeleton and reunite it with the skull, and then the entire fossil was sold to a collector. Unfortunately, the rest of the skeleton has disappeared. Nobody knows what happened to it. It's probably buried in an attic somewhere, and maybe someday it'll come to light. The first person to study this fossil skull was a doctor at the Royal College of Surgeons named Everard Home, and he concluded that this was actually a fish. He said that this animal is more closely allied to fish than anything else, which isn't even close, and it didn't take long for other people to study ichthyosaur remains and realize that this was not a fish, it was a reptile, but a reptile that looked a lot like a fish. Georges Cuvier in 1812 studied some ichthyosaur fossils and called them crocodiles for obvious reasons. Later on in 1821, Henry de la Beche and William Conybeare published a paper where they clearly pointed out that this animal was a reptile, but a very fish-like reptile. Here are some of Mary's ichthyosaur fossils. So here's a complete ichthyosaur called Temnodontosaurus that she collected, this one in 1832. Here's another large ichthyosaur skull full of these kind of pointy conical teeth, very, very good for catching and trapping large fish, and squid. Fish and squid were what these animals fed on. And we know that because in the complete specimens, you can find the remains of their meals in their abdominal cavities. So you find lots of belemnites, thunderstones, and the hooks from the tentacles of squid, and then fish bones. The other marine reptile that Mary Anning found is the plesiosaur, and she is the first person to ever find a complete plesiosaur skeleton. And plesiosaurs were very strange animals with a kind of a stout body. They didn't use their tails to propel themselves through the water. Most paleontologists now think that they swam much the same way penguins do, by using their fins almost as wings to fly through the water. And then these enormously long necks with a relatively small head at the end, with lots of long, sharp teeth for, again, trapping and catching squid and fish. So, you could maneuver this large body into a school of fish and then just keep reaching out with that long neck and feeding on the fish without having to do a lot of swimming. Plesiosaur, the word means almost lizard. So the people who studied, like Dillabesh and Conybeare, who studied the first remains, the disarticulated bones of plesiosaurs, recognized that these bones looked a lot more like lizard bones than the bones of the ichthyosaur, which looked more like fish bones. They knew the animals had paddle-like fins because portions of the fins had been discovered, but nobody knew what the complete animal looked like until Mary Anning discovered a complete one. And even the incomplete specimens that were described back in 1821, some of them were found by Mary Anning and sold to the savants. This is a sketch for Conybeare's publication in 1824, where he described the first complete plesiosaur skeleton that was discovered, excavated, and kind of put back together, by Mary Anning. So the individual slabs with the different parts of the skeleton were uncovered at, in the dig, and then Mary would reunite the slabs and surround them with concrete to hold them together. And a very difficult and time-consuming process of cleaning the rock away from the bones to expose the skeleton. And so this is not easy work. It's highly skilled work, and she was probably the best person in the world to excavate these skeletons. This particular fossil was presented to a meeting of the Geological Society of London in 1824 in a paper that was written by William Conybeare. At the same meeting, William Buckland presented his paper describing the first dinosaur fossil, Megalosaurus. So again, this was a very important time in the history of geology and paleontology. There is that specimen in the Natural History Museum on display, and it's absolutely magnificent. You can only imagine what people would have thought looking at something like this. I mean, this is an animal that really drives home the idea that the past was very strange, and that, the time when these rock layers were forming was a time in the history of the Earth that was very different from what the Earth is like today. In addition to her skill at finding and excavating and cleaning the specimens, Mary made very careful observations. She was a pretty talented sketch artist, so she made her own sketches, which she could show to people to help send to people to help interest buyers in her specimens. She dissected living squid and fish to better understand their anatomy so she could do a better job of understanding the fossils she was finding. She was literate. She could read and write very well. And so she was a consumer of the scientific literature on fossils. And we know this to be true through a number, through her letters that she wrote to people, to the geologists and to her friends, and also some secondhand reports. And there's this quote here. I won't read it, but basically one of the wealthy vacationers to Lyme Regis wrote back home and described Mary Anning and goes on about how amazing it was that this poor woman could be so knowledgeable about these fossils. And she says that that this poor ignorant girl, by reading an application, has arrived to that degree of knowledge as to be in the habit of writing and talking with professors and other clever men on the subject. And they all acknowledge that she understands more of the science than anyone else in this kingdom. So she had a reputation for being, on par with these clever men, which is pretty impressive. This is a second species of plesiosaur that she found in 1830. And I think she has credit for finding, I think, 4 different species of plesiosaur. She also found the first example of a flying reptile known from the British Isles. Fossils of flying reptiles or pterosaurs, pterodactyl is another term, were known from Germany and France, but she gets credit for finding at the beach at Lyme Regis the first English pterosaur, an animal we now call Dimorphodon. She collected fossil fish as well and made important contributions to the study of fossil fish. She had a close friend who was a member of the wealthier stratum of society, who lived with her sisters in a house in Lyme Regis for most of their adult lives, a woman named Elizabeth Philpott. And Philpott and her sisters were passionate collectors of fossil fish, and they would kind of comb the shoreline with Mary Anning. And a lot of or some of Mary's fish finds ended up in their collections as well. Louis Agassiz, a Swiss geologist who came to Lyme Regis in 1834 because he was writing the definitive monograph on fossil fish. And he knew he needed to look at the fossils in the Philpott's collections and to consult with Mary Anning about buying any fossil fish and also borrowing to draw any fossil fish that she might have had. And he ends up describing 34 new species of fossil fish from the Lyme Regis area in the Philpott collections. And Agassiz gets credit for giving credit where credit is due. He is the only contemporary of Mary Anning who gave her any recognition, and he named 2 species of fish after Mary Anning and 1 species of fish after Elizabeth Philpott. Agassiz, by the way, ends up, after publishing his monograph on fossil fish, he ends up emigrating to the United States and joining the faculty of Harvard University, where he becomes one of the most important geologists in the late 1800s in the United States. And he founds the Museum of Comparative Anatomy, which is still at Harvard University, the Agassiz Museum. Another interesting contribution that Mary Anning makes is that she realizes that these kind of peculiar sort of spirally ridged stones, which the locals called them bezoar stones, are actually fossilized feces, fossil poop from sharks and marine reptiles. She notices that these are found in the abdominal cavities of some of the complete skeletons that she finds, and she brings this to the attention of William Buckland, and the two of them do a little, kind of a groundbreaking little study where they take intestines that they dissect out of sharks, and they fill the intestines with plaster and let them harden and look at the shapes that are created, and they're able to show that, you know, an internal plaster cast of a shark intestine gives you an object that looks just like a bezoar stone. And this photo on the right here shows a cabinet in the Natural History Museum, which contains the plaster casts of shark intestines that Mary Anning and William Buckland made. They still have them in the collections. So this is one of Mary Anning's discoveries. She brings it to the attention of Buckland, and then Buckland, of course, publishes a paper and kind of gets all the credit for making the discovery. Another really wonderful observation that Mary makes is in excavating fossils of belemnites, the thunderstones, some of which are still surrounded by the outline of the squid animal that had them. She discovers associated with some of the belemnites these black sort of teardrop-shaped structures, which she realizes are fossilized ink sacs from the extinct squid. And she discovers that if you scrape up the black material and mix it with water, you can make ink that's exactly like the modern sepia ink that's derived from squid ink. And again, she brings this to the attention of William Buckland, and he publishes a report on fossil squid ink in 1829, and she doesn't really get the credit. An interesting sideline is that once people realize that you can collect fossil squid ink sacs and reconstitute the ink, drawings of fossils made from fossil squid ink become kind of a hot souvenir item coming out of Lyme Regis. And this is a drawing of an ichthyosaur fossil, an ichthyosaur skull, that was made by Elizabeth Philpott, the fossil fish collector, using fossil squid ink that she then sent in a letter to William Buckland's wife. William Buckland's wife, by the way, was a very, very good geologist in her own right, who was instrumental in furthering her husband's career, but never got any credit herself, as was the custom at the time. Another important personality in all of this is Henry de la Beche. De la Beche is interesting because he grows up in Lyme Regis. And so he knows Mary Anning from childhood, and they were friends in childhood, and they remained friends through their entire life. And he becomes one of England's leading geologists and founds the British Geological Association, which kind of becomes the British Geological Survey. He's one of the people who studies the ichthyosaurs and the plesiosaurs and publishes some of the first papers on them. He's also a very talented artist, a very talented sketch artist and cartoonist. And he paints one of the first, not the first, but one of the first recreations of prehistoric life. Does it as a kind of a pen and ink sketch. And he recreates the sea life of the Jurassic as revealed by the fossils along the Lyme Regis coast. And he ends up turning his sketch into a colored lithograph and selling it to raise money, and he donates the money to Mary Anning so that, again, to kind of help her out financially. She suffers a kind of a financial failure in her adult life. Apparently, she invested some money with a bank or an individual in London, and there was a bankruptcy. It's not clear exactly what happened, but she ended up losing her life savings, and this was a way for him to help her out of that situation. Buckland also, and some of the other geologists come to her rescue in a similar way later in life, where they basically take up a collection and they lobby the government to provide her with an annuity to keep her afloat later in her life. So this is de la Beche's illustration called Duria Antiquior, and it's a wonderful wonderful illustration because it it's almost as if you're looking, into an aquarium, because you see, what's going on above the water and you see what's going on below the water, and you see scenes reconstructing what the ecological interactions of these animals might have been. So you have ichthyosaurs feeding on plesiosaurs and plesiosaurs feeding on pterosaurs. This one's getting sort of pulled out of the sky here. And you have the squid and the fossil fish and the ammonites and crocodiles and turtles. All of the fossils that were known from Lyme Regis are sort of worked into this wonderful illustration here. As I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, Mary Anning died at a relatively young age, at the age of 47, of breast cancer. So she suffered with cancer for about a year or so before it finally took her life on March 9th in 1847. Shortly after she passed away, at the next meeting of the Geological Society of London, her friend Henry de la Beche eulogized her during the formal proceedings of the meeting. Probably the first time in the history of any scientific society where a woman's accomplishments were officially recognized. And this is her eulogy. It's a synopsis of her life. He recounts that when she was an infant, she almost was struck by lightning. Her nursemaid had her at an outdoor gathering, and they were taking shelter under a tree during a thunderstorm, and a lightning bolt hit the tree and killed her nursemaid and two other women who were standing there, but she survived. So quite an extraordinary event that's noteworthy here. And then he lauds her accomplishments and points out how important her work was to the success of he and his colleagues. A little bit late, but at least he acknowledged her. So that is the remarkable story of Mary Anning. People are still finding fossils along the coast of Lyme Regis. I think just a couple years ago, a 9-year-old boy collecting fossils on one of these trips found a small but nearly complete plesiosaur skeleton weathering out of a slab that he happened to flip over. So if you ever get the chance to visit Lyme Regis, I highly recommend it. It's a really, really wonderful, beautiful place and a really fascinating place to learn more about the history of life on Earth and the history of paleontology. All right, so bring us back to me here. And let me open up the chat window, and if anybody wants to hang around and talk and ask questions, I'm all yours. And let me just start by making sure we don't have any questions in the chat. I don't see any new questions in the chat, so feel free to unmute yourself and call out a question.
Bret, she was working as a very young child at this, it seems.
Yeah, so she learned the business of collecting fossils and how to clean them and how to make them attractive for sale from her father. So probably, as soon as she was able to walk, she was probably out on the beach with Dad.
Yeah.
They were, from all reports, they were fairly close. And I mean, which, given that most of her siblings didn't make it much out of infancy, if one of your kids made it to the age of 8, it was probably a big deal. And so she had a close relationship with her father, and she was devastated when he died. But by then she pretty much knew the business.
Yeah, but the whole family, it seems, her brother also.
Well, her brother didn't have much interest in it, and so he he begrudgingly collects fossils until he's old enough to be apprenticed, and he is the family's able to pull together enough money to apprentice him to an upholsterer, and that becomes his business. And he eventually marries, and apparently his wife and Mary didn't get along very well, so he kind of drifts away.
I see. Thank you.
But she clearly was obsessed with the creatures that she was finding, and would have been had she had the opportunities, would have been certainly one of the leading paleontologists of her time.
She had no formal education.
Well, she was educated in grade school by her church.
Ah, I see.
So she was taught to read and write by the church that she attended.
Oh.
But she had, beyond an elementary school level, no real formal education.
Yeah. Amazing.
I suspect there are many stories like this. Hers is a name I've never heard, though I've studied geology, and I wonder, it brings to mind the fact that there must be countless numbers of Mary Annings who contributed to the information, to the knowledge of the more famous scientists who could then expand on it.
Well, that's a really great question. And, she's kind of unusual in that collecting fossils or doing, any kind of collecting or nature study is something that generally only people who could afford the time would do it, right? So there are many unsung heroes of natural history in the 1800s, and many of them are women, but most of them are from the upper class. They are people, again, a lot of women who could afford the time to become obsessed with fossils or plants, and make collections and make observations. And some of them do become acknowledged in their own time, because, if you're wealthy enough, people will pay attention to you no matter what, no matter, what your gender is. A lot of them end up marrying men who share their interests and kind of live out and make their contributions and live out their careers through their husbands. So, I mentioned William Buckland's wife was an accomplished geologist and paleontologist in her own right. Charles Lyell, perhaps the most famous English geologist of all time, his wife was, his field partner, and she was an excellent geologist. But she, anything she wrote, any of the wonderful drawings she made, were done in the service of her husband. So Mary Anning's a little bit unusual in that because she was collecting fossils to make a living, she was that rare member of the lower stratum of society who could afford to do this because she couldn't afford not to. So there may not be very many other Mary Annings out there in the sense of people who were poor, and the other poor people who contributed were the quarrymen, the quarry workers who were finding all of the interesting bones and skeletons and fossils that were coming out of stone quarries and lithographic limestone quarries and places like that, who would in the course of their jobs find these things, hold on to them, and then sell them to the collectors to supplement their income. And their names are lost to history for sure.
It makes me wonder about how many individual specimens must be sitting on the desks of collectors around the world, that if they were made public, made aware to scientists, it would change our view of how evolution proceeded.
Yeah, sure. So there are countless specimens in private collections that may someday, wind up in a museum, because people die and other people inherit their collections who aren't interested in them, and are willing to sell them or to donate them. There are countless interesting specimens that are buried in collections in museums already that, I mean, one of the best ways to find exciting new things is to dig through drawers, forgotten drawers in places like the Natural History Museum, the American Museum, the Smithsonian, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, people find important fossils all the time because they were misidentified or misplaced. I want to just take a look at the chat here. Is the museum in her hometown totally devoted to Mary and the local fossils? The first floor of the museum is devoted to the history of Lyme Regis, and it's a fascinating, fascinating series of exhibits because, Lyme Regis goes back to the Roman occupation and even before. The second floor of the museum is devoted primarily to Mary Anning and her colleagues in paleontology. Let's see, who are some of the pioneering women geologists in America? The name that immediately comes to mind is Winifred Goldring, who was one of the state paleontologists of New York in the early 20th century. And her kind of claim to paleontological fame is the work that she did describing fossils from the Catskills, which document the oldest fossil forests anywhere in the world. So she did some really important work on that, and then working through the State Museum became one of our state paleontologists. And then there are many important modern paleontologists who are women. One who I know professionally is Susan Kidwell, who's at the University of Chicago, and who has done some really important work in a bunch of different areas in paleontology. I once had the honor of being screamed at by Sue Kidwell on a field trip. Because it was a very Mary Anning sort of situation. I was on a field trip along the coast, the cliffs on the southern part of the Chesapeake in Maryland, near where they call a place they call Scientist Cliffs, and a section of the cliff was slowly collapsing down onto the beach from 50 or 60 feet above. And that collapse had exposed some bones. And I was the first person to get to the slump on the beach, and I started picking up these bones, which turned out to be crocodile bones, right? So crocodiles were living in Maryland in the Chesapeake region, 10 million years ago or so. And, the cliff is about to, any minute come down and bury me. And I'm oblivious, collecting bones, and Sue Kidwell comes running down the beach screaming bloody murder at me. Get out of there. Proudest moment of my life. Let's see, someone points out that even in our time, Edwin Hubble's wife, for example, was a Phi Beta Kappa grad of Stanford University, but relegated to the role of hostess for her husband's guests, including Einstein. When Edwin died, she refused to have a funeral for him and never revealed what happened to his body. That's pretty good. Any other questions? I can. All right. Well, thank you for coming, and I hope everyone enjoyed it. Hope you learned something, and have a great day.